So despite Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 being basically untalked about by the developers themselves, I and a few other people have been able to find out a decent bit of information to give some insight as to what the third chapter may contain. And while I've theorized both the characters in Poppy Playtime and the actual locations and such, I think that right now I've discovered a much more objective theory here today to combine all this information to create what I think is a more revised and clear theory on what we will see in Poppy Playtime Chapter 3. And it all starts with, of course, Chapter 2 and its ending. I'm assuming most of you guys are familiar with the ending, but to recap, after saving Poppy from Mommy Longlegs, we finally attempt to escape through this train where Poppy seems to turn against us, saying in both the final ending and the leaked unused ending that terrible things have happened, and that we could help her solve all of these problems, but also noting that she was responsible for plenty of deaths inside of the factory, along with her actually intimidating us by claiming that she cannot let us leave, among other things. Anyway, all this is important because it sets ourselves a lot of boundaries to expect both in terms of story and where we physically are present in the location. In terms of story, we know that Poppy seems upset with us. I've made a whole video talking about who I thought was going to be the main couple of characters for Chapter 3, but I'll save you the watch and just tell you that my two character predictions were Kissy Missy and Poppy Playtime. Remember Kissy Missy for the future portions of the video, but for now I just want to focus on Poppy and her role in the third chapter. Obviously, we're not quite sure what her actual physical activities will be in Chapter 3, but we know that Poppy in Chapter 2 was actually helping us in the factory by a lot of people's definition. But on this final train ride, when we're told about her real intentions, it tells us realistically that the only reason she was actually helping us throughout the factory was for one reason and for one reason only. And that's because while she was our, I guess, guide through the factory, we were the ones actually guiding her as we start to find out we're leading her to the exit of the factory for herself. And while she is helping us solve these mysteries for ourselves, she makes it pretty clear to us that it comes at a price. And that price is to help her out live her life in the free world as a doll. But while we know exactly what she wants us to do for her in the next chapter, in terms of locations, the place she wants to bring us to is a place by the name of the Playcare. We know this because she says it in the leaked ending, and because there's a sign the train follows that literally says Playcare on it. Now, while this piece of information is initially small, when analyzing it deeper, it expands into a million different new levels. So first, let's start off with the purpose of this location. This is the exact spot that Poppy had told us was where we needed to go to get more answers in regards to what happened to the rest of the employees. And something that we'll notice about this name is that it sounds very similar to the words daycare. It seems pretty obvious that this is an intentional detail, especially since we have plenty of hints that this factory was designed for children to be around, from its playgrounds to the childish atmosphere of the entire place. This is also why it's mentioned in the Poppy Playtime initial Chapter 1 teaser that this factory took tours. It explains why the entire vibe of the factory is reminiscent of something like the Teletubbies or whatnot, because it's clearly designed to appeal to kids despite it being a factory. Anyway, that tells us that this place is a hotspot for children, but we also know that there may have been more permanent positioning of children inside of this factory. One of the biggest ways that we know about this is because there's a poster on the wall in the game where we hear about a Poppy Playtime orphan program that was made inside of the game to help orphans get adopted. The poster reads, quote, "The Playtime Co foster and adoptive care initiative strives to create permanency in the lives of orphan children by recruiting adoptive and foster parents within our own organization. We encourage all Playtime Co employees to take part in our mission by fostering or adopting an orphan child. The initiative helps children not only in the Midwest region, but also orphans around the world." So side note, this gives us a location for Playtime Co, that of which being somewhere in the Midwest of America. More specifically, I actually think the location is St. Louis, just because that also is a Midwest location, and it happens to be the same location where the developers of Poppy Playtime in real life are located at. So it makes sense that for simplicity's sake, it could be located in a similar area. That could be the case, but it's also possible I'm being biased because I also live in St. Louis and I think it's pretty cool. But going back on track, what this tells us is that there's children being held somewhere or being organized in some way by the Poppy Playtime company to help these children find new homes. However, legitimacy of this program aside, regardless, there are all these different children that are in Playtime Co's hands. And so with that being said, what will they do with them? Well, in my opinion, I actually think that they're turning some of these kids into experiments for their own successes. Thanks to Mommy Longlegs having an experiment number of 1222, we know that there were at the very bare minimum 222 different experiments going around the factory. And it's pretty safe to say that working on these experiments had to be pretty damn difficult, because coming up with hundreds of willing people to experiment on must be pretty difficult, and using people as test subjects for your own experiments that tend to go wrong isn't really a great idea, because I mean, the people's friends and family most likely will wonder where they have gone. So how in the world could Playtime Co deal with these issues when turning these people into experiments? Well, what I'm about to say is super fucked up, but please bear with me. I believe that this orphan initiative by some degree was a test subject farm for Playtime Co. I can't be exactly sure at the moment where they got these orphans from, but we know a few things. One, that these orphans would most likely be young, impressionable, and naive children, which would be really handy for doing things like convincing them to do something rather dangerous. Two, we know that there would probably be a lot of these children, just based on the fact that there was an entire program developed around adopting these children, so there'd probably imaginably be a decent amount of them. And the worst piece of evidence of all, orphan children are, well, orphaned, meaning they most likely do not have much of a family to fall back on if something were to happen with them. So with that being said, all of these people that they're making a program to save would honestly be the perfect test subjects to use for these experiments. Anyway, we know all this pretty convincingly now, but what does this have anything to do with Poppy Playtime Chapter 3? Well, let's go back to the name of the location in Chapter 3. It's gonna be called the Playcare. And I mean, if this really is the Playtime Co's version of a daycare, that means that this was going to be the place where the children used to end up being. And the reason why that's so important is because, well, Poppy herself had told us in the alternate ending that going to the Playcare is where we'll find out what happened to all the employees. And with that being said, it seems like we've not only figured out what location we'll be in for Chapter 3, but it also seems like this location is where a lot of these experiments may have initially happened. We could be visiting the location where the kids of these experiments were initially watched over. We've already seen tons of remnants of the children being around, like the as mentioned playground areas in Chapter 2, and similarly, the Playcare seems to be a place designed for children to be in. So that seems like it's going to be the place where we find out a lot about the story for the children who used to exist. But the thing is, it doesn't end here, because I've seen one somewhat radical theory that has been gaining a lot of backing recently that is actually confusingly sensible despite how crazy it sounds. So Kissy Missy, as I've mentioned before, is somebody who I've thought in past videos would be a Chapter 3 main character. And the only reason why I thought this is because she was such an important character in Chapter 2, because for whatever reason she seemed to help us throughout the factory, unlike what any of the characters have done thus far. But there's been a theory floating around recently that is interesting to say the least. The theory states that the monsters in the factory have all gone rogue. Not too hard to see that, because I mean, they all try to kill us. However, there are two exceptions to this rule. Poppy herself, because I mean, she was found unconscious protected behind a cage, and Kissy Missy, who decides to help us despite her quote other half, Huggy, being literally killed indirectly by us. But the reason why this happened according to this theory is because Kissy Missy may have been able to avoid this huge wave of monsters going rogue by actually staying in touch with some of the children who were left alive inside of the factory. The reason why people think the monsters initially went rogue was because their initial experiments were designed to make them interactable and alive with the other kids. However, with there being no kids in the factory anymore, there's a lack of purpose for these toys. So therefore, simply put, they went crazy. But for Kissy Missy, some people believe that she must have had some sort of contact with children in the factory, because for whatever reason, she just doesn't go rogue at all. And we can actually theorize that there are children here in the factory, because in the original note of Chapter 1, we are given a note written quite clearly by a child asking us to return to the building. Now, some people alter this theory by saying that whoever wrote this note wrote it into tricking us into going to the factory by making it seem like it was written by a kid. And I can somewhat actually understand that being the case, but who could have done it? I mean, sure, some of the characters talk, but Mommy Longlegs isn't writing anything. Poppy Playtime was locked in the cage. The only real contender I can think of would actually be the prototype, because we know he's really smart and did not seem to be too fond of the employees. But then again, that doesn't explain why in the world Kissy Missy ends up being nice to us. But for simplicity's sake, let's say that we stick by our own theory and give it the benefit of the doubt. This then leaves us with one more burning question. Where in the world would these children be hiding? Well, I think it's actually pretty obvious. The place where they've been held for all these years. The place Poppy said we would find answers as to what happened to all the employees. The place that'll be the location of Poppy Playtime Chapter 3, that of which being the Playcare. Could this be correct? I'm not sure. Do I want it to be? Hell yes. That would be super cool and really interesting. But I guess we're really just gonna have to wait for Chapter 3 to know for sure. In the meantime, check out this video on every Poppy Playtime character's overview for Chapter 3. Subscribe so you don't miss any more Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 news, and peace.